They endured captivity, adapted to routine, and survived everything the camp demanded of them. But what happens when men hold themselves together long enough to leave, only to discover that the collapse they avoided for years arrives quietly afterward? When no one is watching, no one is counting, and nothing external remains to explain why they are suddenly no longer able to endure at all? For a long time, endurance had been enough, because endurance was what captivity demanded. And as long as the men could continue functioning, nothing else was required of them. Inside the camp, survival had a clear definition, measured by getting through the day without incident, following routines that reduced uncertainty, and conserving energy wherever possible. Holding themselves together was not optional because collapse would have made survival harder, and so they learned how to delay it. This delay became a skill, practiced daily without conscious thought, as the men suppressed exhaustion, confusion, and doubt in order to remain operational. The camp rewarded this restraint quietly, because those who endured without drawing attention experienced fewer disruptions and fewer risks. Over time, endurance stopped feeling temporary and began to feel permanent, as if holding on indefinitely was not only possible, but expected. What the men did not realize was that endurance has limits that are not always visible while they're being approached. The mind can postpone collapse far longer than the body, storing strain in ways that do not interfere with immediate function. Inside the camp, there was no space for that strain to surface because survival left no margin for breakdown. Every day demanded continuation, and continuation became automatic. When the men finally left the camp, they carried this habit with them, continuing to function as if survival were still the primary task. They appeared stable, capable, and composed because outward behavior had been shaped by years of necessity. Others saw resilience, assuming that endurance inside the camp meant strength outside it as well. Yet without the structure that had required constant restraint, the effort of holding everything together began to lose its purpose. Endurance no longer led anywhere because there was no longer a daily threat that justified it. The men were no longer surviving something specific, and without that focus, the accumulated strain had nowhere to go. Small disruptions began to appear, not as dramatic breakdowns, but as moments of fatigue that did not resolve with rest, irritability without clear cause, and emotional flatness that lingered longer than expected. These signs were easy to dismiss at first, because the men had learned to minimize discomfort, and because nothing seemed severe enough to warrant concern. What made this stage particularly dangerous was its subtlety, because the men were still functioning well enough to avoid attention. They continued to work, to speak, and to participate in daily life. Yet the effort required to maintain this appearance increased steadily. Endurance, once protective, began to consume more energy than it preserved. The men noticed that recovery did not come naturally because recovery had never been part of survival training. Inside the camp, rest was merely a pause before continuation, not a process of restoration. Outside, that pattern remained, leaving the men exhausted without understanding why rest no longer helped. As days turned into months, the gap between outward stability and internal strain widened, creating tension that could not be resolved through discipline alone. The men had survived the camp by learning how not to break, but now they were facing a condition where breaking was no longer delayed by necessity. By the end of this phase, it became clear that endurance had carried them through captivity, but it had also postponed something unavoidable. The collapse they had successfully delayed inside the camp was no longer being held back by circumstance, and without warning, it was beginning to surface in a world that expected strength to mean recovery, not realization. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. As the structure that once justified endurance faded, the men began to realize that the strength they relied on no longer produced the same results, because strength without a clear purpose becomes strain rather than support. Inside the camp, effort had always been directed toward survival, but outside, effort lacked direction, leaving the men expending energy without understanding what it was meant to achieve. They noticed that tasks which once felt manageable now required disproportionate effort, as if the internal reserve they had depended on had quietly emptied. Concentration became harder to sustain, motivation arrived inconsistently, and recovery took longer than it used to. These changes did not announce themselves dramatically, but accumulated slowly, creating a sense that something fundamental was no longer responding as expected. The men attempted to apply the same discipline that had sustained them in captivity, believing that persistence alone would restore balance. They pushed through fatigue, ignored emotional signals, and maintained outward composure because these strategies had once ensured survival. What they discovered instead was that persistence now intensified exhaustion rather than resolving it. This realization unsettled them deeply because it challenged the belief that endurance was always beneficial. The tools that had protected them for years were now producing the opposite effect, leaving them depleted without offering stability. Strength, once a reliable solution, had become ineffective in a context that no longer demanded constant restraint. They became aware that their bodies and minds were no longer aligned, because the mind continued to demand continuation while the body resisted quietly. Signals that had been suppressed during captivity now surfaced unexpectedly, appearing as physical tension, emotional numbness, or sudden irritability without clear cause. These responses felt unfamiliar because survival had required them to ignore such signals entirely. The men struggled to explain this shift because from the outside, nothing appeared wrong. They were free, employed, and present, fulfilling expectations that suggested recovery. Internally, however, the effort required to maintain this appearance increased steadily, and the absence of visible cause made the struggle harder to articulate. What made this stage particularly isolating was the lack of a clear narrative. During captivity, hardship had an obvious explanation, but now discomfort appeared without context, leaving the men questioning their own resilience. They wondered why endurance had stopped working, and whether the failure lay in themselves rather than in the conditions they were facing. As the days continued, they sensed that something had changed permanently because rest no longer restored energy and discipline no longer produced clarity. The habits formed under survival conditions were now misaligned with a life that required flexibility rather than rigidity. The men were still trying to endure, but endurance alone no longer led anywhere. By the end of this phase, it became clear that surviving the camp had depended on strength applied in one direction, and that outside the camp, that same strength required transformation rather than repetition. The men were beginning to understand that holding on was no longer enough, and that the collapse they had postponed was now unfolding slowly, not as a single moment of failure, but as a gradual realization that the methods which once saved them could no longer sustain them. As the effort to maintain control continued, the men began to sense that something fundamental was shifting beneath the surface, because the strategies that had once kept everything contained were no longer holding. Control, which had been essential inside the camp, now demanded constant attention without delivering the stability it once provided, turning daily life into an exhausting exercise in management rather than movement. They noticed that lapses began to appear unexpectedly, not as dramatic failures, but as small disruptions that accumulated over time. Words were forgotten, Attention drifted without warning, and emotional responses surfaced at moments when composure had previously been automatic. These changes were subtle enough to be dismissed individually, yet persistent enough to create unease. The men attempted to tighten discipline in response, believing that greater control would restore balance, because that logic had always worked before. They monitored themselves more closely, corrected behavior quickly, and avoided situations that felt unpredictable. What they discovered instead was that increased control amplified strain, making each day feel heavier rather than more secure. The effort to suppress signs of difficulty became continuous, because allowing them to surface felt dangerous in a world that expected recovery. The men had learned that appearing functional reduced scrutiny, and so they invested energy in maintaining appearances even as internal reserves diminished. This concealment delayed recognition, but it also accelerated exhaustion. They became aware that control itself was beginning to fracture because it relied on resources that were no longer replenishing. Emotional regulation required focus that could not always be summoned, and physical tension accumulated without release. The men felt themselves reacting rather than responding, a reversal of the restraint they had practiced so carefully during captivity. Moments of disconnection began to occur when the men felt present physically but detached mentally, observing their own actions without feeling fully engaged. These episodes did not resemble panic or collapse, but they undermined confidence because they suggested that control was no longer complete. The ability to manage oneself quietly, once a strength, now felt unreliable. Interactions with others reflected this shift, as patience wore thin and responses became less measured. The men sensed these changes immediately because awareness of behavior had always been sharp, yet correcting them required effort that was increasingly difficult to muster. Each correction drained more energy, leaving less available for the next. They realized that control had become reactive rather than proactive, responding to disruptions after they occurred rather than preventing them altogether. This shift marked a significant change because survival had depended on preventing disruption entirely. Now, disruption was arriving despite their best efforts, signaling that something deeper was unfolding. By the end of this phase, it was clear that the collapse they had postponed was no longer waiting quietly in the background. Control was slipping not because they had stopped trying, but because the conditions that once made control effective no longer existed. The men were facing a reality where containment was failing gradually, revealing that endurance and discipline, while powerful, had limits that could not be extended indefinitely. As control continued to weaken, the men reached a point where the effort required to function began to exceed the benefit it provided, because holding everything together now consumed more energy than it preserved. What had once been a deliberate act of endurance turned into a constant struggle against fatigue, confusion, and emotional weight that no longer stayed contained. They became aware that the signs they had tried to manage quietly were no longer isolated incidents, but part of a pattern that was asserting itself despite resistance. Sleep no longer restored clarity, routine no longer stabilized emotion, and discipline no longer produced reliability. The tools that had carried them through captivity were no longer compatible with the demands of ordinary life. This realization arrived without drama, because collapse did not announce itself loudly. Instead, it appeared as a gradual narrowing of capacity, where fewer tasks could be managed without strain and fewer situations felt tolerable without withdrawal. The men adjusted by reducing engagement, simplifying obligations, and avoiding complexity wherever possible, not out of choice, but out of necessity. They noticed that the margin for error had disappeared, because even small disruptions now produce disproportionate consequences. A minor setback could linger for days. A brief conflict could drain energy completely, and unexpected demands could leave them feeling depleted without understanding why. The resilience that once defined them no longer buffered these effects. The men sensed that they were no longer recovering between efforts, but merely enduring them, moving from one obligation to the next without restoration. This state felt eerily familiar, echoing the later stages of captivity when survival had depended on minimizing exposure rather than pursuing relief. The difference was that now, survival no longer justified this condition. They struggled with the implication that something inside them had changed permanently, because acknowledging permanence conflicted with the belief that endurance guaranteed recovery. The idea that surviving the camp had not ensured long-term stability challenged deeply held assumptions about strength, resilience, and reward. Attempts to explain this condition to others often failed, because the struggle lacked visible markers. There were no clear wounds, no dramatic breakdowns, and no external cause that could be easily identified. From the outside, the men still appeared functional, making the internal collapse harder to validate and easier to dismiss, even by themselves. As the gap between appearance and experience widened, the men began to understand that collapse was not a single event they could prepare for or prevent, but a process already underway. The effort to stop it had become part of the problem, as resistance consumed the last remaining reserves without altering the outcome. By the end of this phase, it was clear that what they were facing was not failure, but the delayed cost of survival itself. The collapse they had avoided inside the camp was now unfolding slowly, shaped by years of restraint and postponed release, and there was no longer a strategy that could return them to the stability they once maintained. When resistance was no longer sustainable, the men did not experience a sudden collapse, because collapse had already been unfolding quietly for a long time. What emerged instead was a state of diminished capacity, where life continued in a narrower form, shaped less by intention and more by limitation. The effort to hold everything together receded, not because things improved, but because there was nothing left to resist with. They learned to function within reduced boundaries, carefully managing energy, attention, and emotional exposure in order to avoid further strain. Activities were chosen not for fulfillment, but for tolerability, and decisions were made with the primary goal of preserving stability rather than pursuing progress. Life became smaller, but more predictable, echoing the late stages of captivity where survival had depended on minimizing engagement. The men noticed that ambition no longer returned naturally, because ambition requires belief in expansion, and expansion now felt unsafe. Instead, they focused on maintenance, on keeping disruption at bay, and on preserving what little equilibrium remained. This shift did not feel like surrender, but like adaptation to a reality that no longer responded to force of will. Relationships adjusted accordingly, becoming selective and contained. The men maintained connection where it felt manageable, yet avoided emotional intensity that could destabilize the fragile balance they had achieved. Intimacy, once imagined as restorative, now appeared demanding, because it required vulnerability that endurance had long suppressed. They came to understand that the collapse they feared had not destroyed them, but had redefined the limits within which they could live. What survived was not the version of themselves they had expected to recover, but a quieter self shaped by restraint, caution, and acute awareness of internal boundaries. Life continued, though altered, within parameters that felt safer than openness. This realization brought neither relief nor despair, but acceptance, because acceptance required less energy than continued resistance. The men stopped waiting for a return to how things had been, and instead focused on navigating what remained with care. The struggle shifted from holding on to learning how to live within what survival had left behind. By the end of this phase, it became clear that surviving the camp had delayed, rather than prevented, the cost of endurance. The breaking point they had avoided under confinement arrived later, without drama, without witnesses, and without a clear moment of beginning or end. What followed was not failure, but a quieter form of life shaped by the limits that survival itself had imposed. And so they carried on, not as men who had overcome everything, but as men who had learned, slowly and painfully, that endurance can save a life, but it can also reshape it forever. Surviving the camp had required endurance, restraint, and the ability to hold everything together long enough to get through each day. What followed afterward required something different, something no one had explained or prepared them for. The strength that once saved them did not disappear, but it no longer worked in the same way. The collapse did not arrive as a moment of failure, but as a gradual settling into limits shaped by years of survival without release. Life continued, quieter and narrower, guided less by ambition and more by the careful management of what remained. There were no fences anymore, yet the habits formed behind them continued to define what felt safe and possible. In the end, the men understood that the hardest part of their journey had not been captivity itself, but the long aftermath of endurance, when survival was no longer required, and living demanded something endurance alone could not provide. And so the war ended for the world, but for them, its final cost revealed itself only later, in the silence that followed survival. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.